All right, good morning, everybody. Hope everyone had a nice break. We are here to have a little conversation about artificial intelligence. My name is Forrest Bennett. I'm a state representative from Oklahoma. I'm also the chair of the INCOIL Financial Services and Multi-Lines Issues Committee, and I'll be moderating this general session. We have a great panel of speakers with us here today to discuss perhaps the most topical and interesting issue currently facing not just the insurance industry, but our society as a whole, which is the continued growth and prevalence of artificial intelligence. One recurring argument that happens in my home is whether or not you need to say please and thank you to smart home speakers like Alexa. I always say thank you. My wife is sometimes maybe a little bit more verbally abusive, and my argument is that when our benevolent overlord robots take over, I'll be spared. That's not a specific question for the panelists today, but I welcome any of them to talk about it if they want. We will have a great opportunity to hear different views on the positives and negatives of this continued growth, discuss how the growth is currently impacting the insurance industry, and discuss what type of new policy should be implemented to ensure that consumers are protected against potential harms from artificial intelligence, while at the same time ensuring that we don't stifle innovation that AI can provide. Also, in your binders, starting on page 61, is some material that will be referenced throughout the session. That can be found on the website and the app as well. And the app meeting code, if you want to know, is INCOIL, all caps, 23. Before we get any further, I want to note that unfortunately one of the scheduled speakers, Colorado Commissioner Mike Conway, wasn't able to be with us today because of an illness, but you can still view his presentation and his accompanying materials on the website and app. And he encourages anyone with questions to reach out to him. And lastly, many of you by now have probably utilized ChatGPT in some manner, but just to give you an idea of how powerful the technology is, we asked it the question, what are the pros and cons of the state-based system of insurance regulation? And it generated the response before you in about 3 minutes. Sorry, 3 seconds. 3 minutes would be embarrassing, I'm sure. 3 seconds is pretty amazing. So I don't want to take up any more of our time from the panel, as we want to make sure there's plenty of time for questions and answers, which we will hold until the end of all of their presentations. But joining us today to discuss these issues are Jamin Kim, the Senior VP of Emerging Technologies and Cyber Practice, the US and Canada at Marsh, Christine Huberty, Lead Benefit Specialist, Supervising Attorney at the Elder Law and Advocacy Center, Greater Wisconsin Agency on Aging Resources, the Honorable Kathleen Burain, Maryland Insurance Commissioner, and Adam Isles, Principal and Head of Cybersecurity Practice at the Chertoff Group. To learn more about these speakers, you can see their bios in the program and also on the app, and I encourage anyone who's interested in what they have to say to reach out to them afterwards to learn more. In terms of format, like I said, we'll hold all questions until the panelists are finished speaking, so let's get started. Jamie, we'll begin with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Representative Bennett. And I want to first say thank you to INCOIL for allowing us the opportunity to have a conversation about what's, as we know, been the hot topic this year across private and private sectors. I am Jamin Kim. I'm a Senior Vice President of Emerging Technologies with Marsh. And I'm here to briefly tell you about how we view generative AI and corresponding risk and insurance considerations. So, as many of us know, 2023 has been the year of generative AI. According to some, it's the best thing since sliced bread. According to others, it's a doomsday scenario, we're all going to die. The reality is, it's probably somewhere in between. That being said, we are in the early days. It's been perhaps 12 months since we saw ChatGPT 3.5 catch the world by storm, hitting headlines towards the end of last year. Just by a quick show of hands, I want to ask everyone in the room, who has tried out the likes of ChatGPT, DALL-E, Midjourney? That's great to see. It's, I would say, well over 50%. For those of us who have yet to try it out, I encourage you to do so. It's the best way to gain a quick understanding of what the world is a buzz of today when it comes to generative AI specifically. Despite the fact that we're in nascent days, generative AI as a technology is being leveraged by numerous industries and early mover companies. I won't go into all of the use cases you see on the slide before you, but to give you a sprinkling, in the financial services sector, we're seeing GPT-like technology being used to equip wealth advisors more efficiently access some of the dense financial data in serving their clients, all the way to Bloomberg GPT, which purports to conduct financial sentiment analysis on things like FOMC meeting notes in order to assess whether the market sentiment might go up or down. Healthcare is not unfamiliar with artificial intelligence in general. When it comes to generative AI specifically, it's being used in these early days to help doctors and surgeons answer dense medical questions more efficiently, as well as ideally generate more accurate differential diagnoses. Entertainment sector, of course, we've been hearing about in the headlines with various strikes ongoing. Various generative AI systems have been used to generate 2D images and rapidly turn into 3D versions being commercialized within production, all the way to things like the song Heart on My Sleeve. Some of us might have heard. It was characteristic of Drake vocals, went viral. It was very good. I personally liked it. It was taken down because of a lawsuit. Retail, real estate, sports and events, the list continues. Before we talk about some various buzzwords that we've been hearing about, such as generative AI, large language models, foundational models, before we get into these, I want us to take a step back and briefly consider, what are we even talking about when we talk about artificial intelligence? Artificial intelligence, or AI, is a pretty broad field that generally refers to computational systems that aim to simulate specific aspects of human intelligence. The broad, diverse field of AI can be broken down further into narrow versus general. Narrow AI actually refers to all instances of artificial intelligence systems that exist so far. Knock on wood, so far. It's aptly named narrow because all of these artificial intelligence systems that exist to date are pretty limited to specific domains of human intelligence. For example, human language text versus images. The second subset, called general AI, is a theoretical construct at best today, and yet remains the ambitious goal of companies like OpenAI and xAI. General AI refers to artificial intelligence that would be more like you and me, in that it would be more human. It's able to write prose and poetry, sing songs, try to dance, conduct robotic tasks, all within the span of a single hour. It wouldn't be limited to specific domains. Generative AI is actually simply one subset of narrow AI, and is differentiated by its ability to create net new content across these specified domains like text and images. Double-clicking into narrow AI, which again refers to all forms of AI that so far exist in our world today. It's important to consider that artificial intelligence is not new. It's actually been around since the 1950s, when we originally started with techniques that were more linear, such as with knowledge-based systems, more decision trees, if you'd like. Over the recent decades, we've seen significant advancements in the fields of machine learning and deep learning. Deep learning is a subset of machine learning techniques that were inspired by the human brain and how the machines, quote unquote, learn. Generative AI employs primarily deep learning techniques to specific domains of human intelligence. When you hear of ChatGPT, you're actually hearing about deep learning techniques that are applied to the specific domain of natural language processing. When you hear about DALL-E or Midjourney, what we're talking about is deep learning techniques applied to the specific domain of generative art. It's worth considering, however, even in the recent weeks or month, I would say, we're increasingly seeing multimodal systems. And so if you're a premium subscriber to ChatGPT, you can now access not only human language text, but also ask it to synthesize and produce images. I often get the question from various company executives and various insurance industry professionals, if AI has been around since the 1950s, why has 2023 become the year of artificial intelligence? Well, this year it seems that when people talk about AI, they tend to, although not necessarily all the time, be talking about generative AI, a subset of AI. And I think the answer as to why this year has become the year of generative AI comes down to three key distinctions in how generative AI parts from previously existing forms of more traditional AI, more predictive AI. The first key distinction lies in generative AI's ability to create new content. Previously existing forms of, let's say, more traditional AI were primarily used for classification tasks. For example, filtering spam from your email inboxes. Generative AI is distinguished by its ability to create net new content that, prior to these machines spitting out, did not exist. The second way that generative AI parts from previously existing forms of AI is in how it learns. Whereas more traditional forms of AI that predate generative AI would learn to predict based on the data points in its training data sets, generative AI goes a step further and actually learns the underlying statistical distribution that lies in between those data points. It infers net new patterns that underlie the specific data points in its training data set, and in so doing, it's able to create net new content that is similar to, and yet entirely distinct from, that original training data set. The third way generative AI parts from previously existing forms of AI, though, is perhaps the most important reason why this year has become the year of AI. And that's in how we understand human and AI interaction. I like to describe my interactions with traditional forms of AI as a one-way street. Before, I would give the AI system an instruction and say, execute X. It would execute, it wouldn't talk back to me. Today, with generative AI systems like Bard and Claude and ChatGPT, human interaction with these systems have become a two-way street. In fact, if I'm feeling bored one day, I don't even have to give ChatGPT a set of instructions. I can simply strike up a conversation, and it talks straight back to me in a believable, human-like way, in a complex, sophisticated way. So believable that some have even argued that these machines are becoming sentient. I know that there is the infamous case of the former Google engineer who argued with his bosses that the machine he was working on was sentient and was let go because of this. These machines are not sentient, or at least not yet, but the point is that's how believable they are in their outputs. There's a lot of material out there explaining what generative AI is in very technical terms. There wasn't a lot out there explaining, here are, at a high level, the key components of generative AI and the corresponding risks. For that reason, this is Marsh's conceptual risk framework that is specific to generative AI. Briefly, I would like us to consider some of the key components that go into creating generative AI systems and the corresponding risk considerations. The first key component lies in its training data. Here it's important to understand that the training data is simply massive volumes of big data sets. The associated risk consideration here is that the original training data set's scale and quality can often have an outsized, non-linear impact on the model performance. We can imagine scenarios where malicious actors might inject nuanced malicious code into that original training data set. Even if we did specify later on precisely what they had changed, we may not be able to explain in a linear fashion or a completely explainable fashion what the impact is on how the model performs going forward. The second key component is the model itself with its underlying architectures and algorithms and the training process itself. Here it's important to consider that the experts that create these systems themselves are not always able to explain with 100% explainability why we get XYZ outputs from 1 to 3 inputs or the training process itself. Sometimes what we see is the development of emergent capabilities, which is a phrase that's used to describe abilities that generative AI systems develop, abilities that they were not originally programmed to or designed to produce. A positive instance of this would, for example, be a language-based generative AI model that is fed with massive big data sets of the English language, and then some weeks later we find out that it's able to read, review, and write code. The third component is the prompt. For the many of us in this room who have tried out the likes of ChatGPT and Bard, we know that the human text, the English text, or whatever language we use to prompt these systems is the starting point for generating an output from the AI system. Here it's important to consider that sometimes, depending on the specific instance of the generative AI system that we're using, the data that we provide as the human end user into that prompt box may lead to various data privacy and security concerns. It's important for every company and public sector institution to have a clear guideline and policy for what kind of data can be input and not. Then there is the output of the generative AI system itself. Many of the big media headlines in 2023 have been along the lines of, ChatGPT lied to me, or this thing is deceptive. What they're really talking about is instances of hallucinations, also known as confabulations. Hallucinations is a word that's used to simply describe when something like ChatGPT spits out nonsense or error in its output. Hallucinations tend to happen in one of two scenarios. The first scenario is when the end user, the end human user, prompts the generative AI system with a scenario that lies outside of its training data, and therefore the AI system is simply not familiar with the scenario that it's being asked about or presented with. But, as many of us know, it will go ahead and give us a response and deliver in a very authoritative tone. The second way we might see an instance of a hallucination occur, though, is when the generative AI system tries to infer patterns where there aren't any. This is actually a pretty human attribute. For example, let's say I'm looking at the beautiful skies of Columbus, Ohio, and I see a smiley face in a cloud. No one put the smiley face there, but I'm human, and sometimes I see patterns even when there aren't any. This is where I'd like us to recall the definition of artificial intelligence more broadly. We're trying to simulate human intelligence. Infrastructure is a key component that reminds us that as believable and human-like these AI systems may be becoming, at the end of the day, we're talking about machines that humans have built for use by humans. That means that these are technology, these are machines that run on underlying hardware and software. Many of the existing and familiar risks, for example, the potential of cloud downtime, are here to stay. But depending on the extent to which any individual or organization increasingly becomes dependent on the smooth and consistent functioning of generative AI system for critical operational tasks, those potential risks with relying on third-party service providers or the potential for cloud downtime risks may be increased in certain cases.
Sorry to interrupt. About two more minutes.
Okay.
We'll have to move on.
The final piece is around operations. Because these are machines that we have created as humans, we require human experts to in an ongoing way, monitor and maintain the performance of these systems. I won't go into all of the detail on this slide, but the main takeaway I want to address is that because generative AI is a technology built by humans for use by humans, a lot could go wrong. There's potential for human error every step of the way. But the silver lining is that there's potential for humans to proactively identify, navigate, and mitigate some of the risks associated with developing and using generative AI. Whether it's having clear policy guidelines around data privacy and security considerations, or the extent to which a training data set needs to be free from bias or discrimination, all the way to ensure that we don't inadvertently enter in personally identifiable information into these systems. The onus is on humans as ever to ensure that we proactively manage some of the risks associated with technology. I'll end with this slide, which is that many of the individuals and organizations that I talk to often ask me, so what does this mean from an insurability standpoint? Sometimes I find that with a new piece of technology that has hit big media headlines, there's a tendency to assume that there must necessarily be net new categories of insurable risk that have emerged. That is not necessarily true. I want to caveat with saying that we are still in the early days of seeing generative AI systems emerge. So far, we don't see anything that is completely net new in terms of insurable risk categories. Risks like copyright infringement, data privacy and security, and/or technological errors are risks that we've become familiar with, at least since the advent of the internet, if not before. What we are finding, though, is that these risks are manifesting in new use cases. And certainly, as emergent capabilities of AI systems develop and/or converge with other technologies such as augmented reality and hologram technology, we may see the emergence of net new insurable categories of risk. And at Marsh, we're proactively trying to stay ahead of how the insurance sector is responding to various claims that emerge specific to generative AI, as well as trying to proactively stay abreast of new emerging technology trends and what that might mean for net new categories of insurable risk that may very likely emerge in the coming years and decades. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Jamin. And Christine, we'll have you go next. We went about 5 minutes past the last speaker, so if we can try to wrap your comments up at around 12:10, that'd be perfect.
Thank you so much. My name is Christine Huberty. I am an attorney from Wisconsin. I work with primarily elder individuals, 60 and over, usually in the areas of healthcare, Medicare, Medicaid, also Social Security, food share, which is our iteration of SNAP. I come to you today to share a cautionary tale of how AI actually can cause patient harm and administrative burden. So I'm going to be kind of the doom and gloom for today. So I just want to start by highlighting a case. Let's see, is it this one? Let's see if I can advance the slide here. How did you get that to? Oh, there we go. Okay. So Jim was a client whose family actually came to our agency for help. He was 81 years old when he came to us. He had been hospitalized for COVID-19 and then developed pneumonia secondary to that. His doctors had advised that he needed to go to a skilled nursing facility for rehabilitation after his hospitalization. This was due to several factors. He had come in with COPD. He was also undergoing chemotherapy for B-cell lymphoma. His doctors said, it'll probably take you about a month. You'll probably need about a month there. We need you to get some rehab before you're able to safely go home. Jim's wife had her own health issues. She wasn't able to care for him. This was the most appropriate, medically appropriate course of action for him. So Jim's insurance, however, uses a third-party subcontractor who uses AI, and that predictive technology ran Jim's situation through its algorithm, and it spit out that instead of 30 days, he actually needed between 14 and 18 days. And lo and behold, he gets his insurance denial on day 16 with the payment cutting off on day 18. Just as the algorithm predicted. Now, Jim's doctors didn't believe that this was the appropriate timeline. He was not ready to go home. His therapist, everyone was fighting this number, but the doctors can't override that number once it's in place. Everybody defers to it. And so Jim ended up going home on day 25, not because he was well enough, but because he was too afraid of the mounting out-of-pocket costs. So his family, luckily, rallied around him and got him safely home. Now, the key issue with this is that AI directed Jim's care, and his doctors could not override that predictive technology. I'm still having a hard time advancing this. Now it's going backwards. There we go. So this is just a sample of what the document looks like, this predictive technology. It is not new. It's been around for at least a decade. It's used by almost all Medicare Advantage plans, so private insurance plans. This is just an example of one of the pages that says, it shows you those dates, that discharge date, that predicted length of stay. The users of the technology will say that it's used, that discharge date is used as a guide only, and that humans do in fact have the final say, the final decision when there's any denials. However, if that's the case, then AI, and also any human that would have reviewed it initially, missed things like Jim wasn't able to swallow on his own. He had actually had a choking episode just days after he was admitted. He couldn't walk the 3 stairs to get into his home. He needed 1 to 2 individuals to assist him with all of his activities of daily living. That's getting in and out of bed, toileting, dressing, bathing. They most egregiously missed the words, currently not safe to return home with wife. So the computers missed it, and then any human that they say actually does do the reviewing before discharge missed that as well. So the other problem is I mentioned that Jim's doctors couldn't override this predicted length of stay and did not agree with it. So then it becomes the onus is then on the patient, has to appeal this denial while they are in the hospital trying to recuperate. And these are people who have had strokes and are paralyzed on one side of their body. They are like Jim, who's has pneumonia and still having trouble swallowing. They're required then to do phone calls and written appeals, sometimes administrative law judge hearings. That's usually where an attorney would step in. An attorney's not required, but most people think that they need one to do something like a hearing. That patient then has the responsibility to fight that algorithm while they're in a time of crisis. I'll also mention that about 1% of all denials are appealed. It's a very, very small number. And of those that are appealed, about 75% are overturned. Our agency has about a 90% success rate, which means in most cases that algorithm is getting it wrong and it's not being challenged. Nationally, it's a national problem. This is not just in Wisconsin, and there are no particularly bad actors. Most Advantage plans are using this predictive technology, but 30.8 million Americans were on Medicare Advantage plans just in 2023. So that gives you an idea of how many of these cases are going unchallenged. This has a ripple effect of not only patient harm. As I said, Jim was very concerned about the costs that it was creating for him to stay and get the care that he needed. The average cost is about $300 in a skilled nursing facility per day. Obviously, he was having a hard time focusing on his health when he was trying to fight this appeal, and his family as well. There's also an increased rate of hospital readmissions when a person discharges home too early and then something happens and they end back up in the hospital. The facilities themselves also are finding that this adhering to that predicted discharge date is causing them to have to submit almost daily updates to those subcontractors using the prediction. They get a low performance rating or a score when they keep people after that predicted discharge date. And actually the facilities themselves are penalized when there's a hospital readmission. So if the person does go home too soon because of that date, they end up rehospitalized. Actually, the facility itself takes a hit from CMS. We're also finding too that these facilities are refusing to take patients who have insurance now that use this predictive technology because they don't want to deal with the administrative burden. A lot of times their nurses and doctors are called to testify at the hearings when we do have them. It takes time away. They're having to spend hours gathering medical records for them to justify why this patient still needs care. So it's having a ripple effect in that way as well. In terms of ongoing economic costs too, Jim's family members had to leave the workforce to come and take care of him. And in many, many instances, a safe discharge plan by an insurance company is that they've identified that the person is likely eligible for Medicaid, so we can shift costs to the state. We don't have to pay because they'll drain their assets on care. They can get on the Medicaid program, which will then give them the care that they need. So looking forward, there is a little hope. A lot of bad news here today, but there's a little hope. So CMS, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, in April of this year did finalize a rule that is looking to get more transparency with when these types of predictive technologies are used, making sure that there is the correct human oversight, and that there is information right now. This predictive technology is kind of hidden and isn't being shared, what kind of data is being used and collected to spit out that number that's being relied on so heavily. I've included the link to that final rule at the bottom of that slide. And then also just this past week, we've had the past 2 weeks, the executive order by President Biden, again, establishing a task force in the next 90 days to look again at that human oversight. What do we need to do as these technologies arise? What kind of limits and parameters do we need to put on them? I would say, though, that while we are focusing on the new and the ChatGPT and all of the new technologies to come and potential harms, I sit before you with a demonstrated patient harm, administrative harm for over a decade. And so I say maybe we use this as a test case. What can we do for things when it's very clear that the AI has gotten it wrong for so many years? What kind of punitive issues, what can we do to challenge these systems that are already in place? Finally, I've included some resources if you want to get a backstory or just more of a detailed look at these issues and how prevalent they are. Kaiser Health News has 2 articles that give you a really good sense of what's happening. I was at the U.S. Senate twice this year, first in May talking specifically about Medicare Advantage, and then just last week about AI in healthcare broadly, basically the same presentation you all are getting. There's links to those hearings as well. And finally, Stat News has given a thorough, in-depth investigation on these practices over the past year, and I've linked to those as well. And I think most excitingly, and maybe it shouldn't have had to get to this point, but 2 of our Wisconsin clients have now, their estates of the deceased clients have initiated a class action lawsuit as of Tuesday of this week to hopefully get some more focus on these practices and get the awards and the restitution that they deserve. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Christine. I found it interesting that while you're presenting the cautionary information, that technology was struggling. I'm not going to read into that at all. Next up, Commissioner Bahrain.
Hi, well, thank you very much, and I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you all today. I don't have any slides, so I'm just going to try to be amusing so that I keep your attention. I have to start by saying that this last circumstance and the situation of Jim and people like Jim is actually quite a statement about the power and the importance of state-based regulation. Because if Jim were in the state of Maryland, Jim wouldn't have had that problem. Because if Jim were in the state of Maryland and there were medical necessity determinations being made by computer algorithms and programs, Jim would have had the ability to come, and all hospitals in Maryland know this, to the Maryland Insurance Administration, which is not unique among the states, where we have a 24/7-hour hotline, 365 days a week, and I have manned it, that allows citizens who are being denied the opportunity based on medical necessity and an insurance company that's trying to override a medical determination, that they can come, and in those cases where they do come, and the uptake rate in Maryland is about 10%, but it's growing because we're advertising it, we reverse them 76% of the time. So if you were in the state of Maryland and this was happening, we also issued an order recently against an insurance company that was involved in a very similar practice than what you've explained here, where the algorithm was kicking things out, but you had no ultimate human evaluation of what was happening. Because a machine may be able to reflect sometimes elements of human intelligence, but a machine is not a medical director. So I think that for all of you who are deeply engaged in state-based insurance regulation, you guys who pass the laws that we utilize in order to protect citizens, when you talk about your citizens who are in the insured market, you have created the framework to protect those citizens. Unfortunately, we don't have regulatory oversight. We don't have jurisdiction over MA plans or federally sponsored plans or employer-sponsored plans. But in the areas that we do have authority and the control and the jurisdiction that you've given us, we're able to protect Jim. And Jim doesn't have to suffer that in the states. And that's not just true. And it would be particularly true in Wisconsin, where Commissioner Hodak is a very firm and deep proponent of consumer responsibility. So what I want to jump into here is the bulletin, which is fundamentally what I'm here to talk about, which is how the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, the states, are approaching the responsible regulation of AI by insurance companies. So as commissioners, we regulate the activities of the business of insurance within our states. And you have enacted already a framework of laws that address the circumstances in which companies exist, how they operate, how they make decisions, what considerations are permissible or impermissible in making those decisions, and the standards that apply to those decisions. And those principles really stretch across broad areas of the entire life cycle of an insurance policy, from marketing considerations all the way through fair and unfair claim settlement practices. So the life of an insurance policy, that consumer journey from beginning to end, is all covered by a set of laws that you have already enacted. And so where the NEIC has gone with this is to look at what is AI, how is it being utilized by insurance companies, how is it being used by them to design products, to make decisions about rates and forms and underwriting processes, how is it being utilized to guide the consumer experience, distribution, how is it being utilized to determine claims and fraud, et cetera. So we have, and so I had to laugh because you're correct. I mean, 2023 has been a bit of the year of AI because it's the big sexy thing in the newspapers. But really for the NEIC, every year has been the year of AI, probably for about the last 10 to 15 years. So the NEIC began this journey through the development of its Innovation and Technology Task Force, which very quickly thereafter developed the Big Data AI Working Group. And the entire purpose of that enterprise has been to really dig deep and broad in understanding, sort of line of business by line of business, how is AI being utilized? How are AI techniques being utilized and systems being developed? We have done private passenger auto, we've done homeowners, we just finished our life insurance study, which we'll have more conversation about for those of you who join us in Orlando at the NAIC's national meeting. And then we're now beginning to work on the survey for health. And it's very important what you said about the interface between health determinations, where AI is being utilized by health practitioners to guide their advice, and health insurers who utilize algorithms that are necessarily tied to those same decisions, how healthy or what is the right treatment. And to that end, we're working with Johns Hopkins in order to help develop our survey so that our survey is particularly sensitive around the unique elements of health. But that's been what the NEIC has done, is really understand what the use cases are. And we know there are tremendous benefits to the use of technology. We all understand the power of these use cases. We know that, for example, in property and casualty insurance in particular, the ability to take huge amounts of data and quickly analyze it and develop patterns is one of the things that allows insurance companies to write risks that they weren't writing before. We have a small but evolving flood insurance, private flood insurance market. That exists because computational power, data, and analytics allows companies to be able to zero in and better determine when they can take on risks. The same thing with regard to areas that are really decimated by natural disasters. The ability of companies to quickly and nimbly adjust their models is what allows them to stay in those businesses. So there's a lot of power. It's wonderful to be able to have a consumer experience where a generative AI model takes what you say the first time you call your customer rep or your claims rep, so that you don't actually have to repeat yourself 27 times every time you make a call. That's going to carry with you. There are lots of ways in which AI is useful and powerful. There are other ways in which it has the capacity to be harmful, but it's harmful in ways that all methods are harmful. So what is insurance other than sort of an art of prediction, right? That's really what insurance companies do. Insurance companies have always gathered a lot of data and then use that data to predict things. They predict things to decide, what do I want to write? Do I want to write this kind of risk or that kind of risk? They use those predictions to decide, what am I going to charge for that risk? Premium rating is always prospective. It's taking things that have happened in the past and then using them to predict what's going to happen in the future. So insurance companies are very much in the business of doing that and have always been in the business of doing that. This is another methodology for doing that. And so because of that, the approach that the NAIC has taken is that we already have, as I mentioned before, a framework of laws that govern what you do. This is a different way of doing what you do, and our task is to provide regulatory guidance around how those laws now apply and what expectations arise in this unique circumstance. So I would say to you that as a regulator, in some ways, I kind of don't care if you're rating a car insurance policy using a slide rule or an abacus, whether you go back to those big, books and binders in the 1950s, or whether you're using a computer model, whether you're using, the most sophisticated of GLMs and other models. In some ways, your methodology is up to you. What I do care deeply about is whether or not, at the end of the day, your model results in rates that meet the statutory standards that you folks in this room have created and expect those companies to live by. So our job as regulators is to understand and to provide guidance and expectations, and then ultimately enforcement actions when the methodology utilized by an insurer fails to meet those standards, results in outcomes that violate the standards that you have developed and you have put into statute for us to apply and follow. So to that end, we started, the H Committee was formed at the beginning of 2022. We're into our second year. We're still a baby committee, but one of the first things that we did was focus on AI. And one of the first things that we did was develop what we called a collaboration forum on AI, which is to bring all of the committees, and there are many at the NAIC, that were touching bits and pieces of the utilization of artificial intelligence systems by insurance companies. We used about a 6-month period of time to dig really deep in an educational effort. It was really important because this touches all of our states. It was really important for every commissioner to have a common foundational understanding of what this stuff was, right? So that we're using similar vocabularies, we're all working from the same ground. I'm an insurance regulatory lawyer, right? And I like to think that I have a reasonable level of intelligence, but I will promise you I am not a mathematician. I know nothing really about computational mathematics. My brother, who is a rocket scientist at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab, just reacts in horror when he hears the word algorithm come out of my mouth because he knows I can barely balance my checkbook, right? So I am really, truly kind of the last person that actually needs to have be working on highly prescriptive rules for insurance companies. So we wanted to make sure that all the folks at the NAIC, all of the commissioners and their senior level people had this really clear foundational knowledge. Algorithm isn't a scary word. Your grandmother's Christmas cookie recipe, right? Or her holiday recipe is really an algorithm. It's a set of instructions, right? So we don't have to be scared of that. But we do have to understand how algorithms can be used in ways that can be harmful to consumers. So we had that foundational education for about a 6-month period with all commissioners at the table. We did a 2-day fly-in in Kansas City. We had 28 commissioners on the ground and about 15 more that were on the phone. We utilized that and we leveraged that to have a very lengthy roundtable in a commissioners' conference in November of '22, where we met, we talked, we broke into working groups, and at the end we came together and had an enormous level of consensus. And that consensus was, we need to articulate a regulatory framework for the responsible use of AI in the insurance industry in the United States, number one. Number two, we need to do it now. Number three, we don't need today. Our next step shouldn't be the development of a model law or regulation. Our next step needs to be guidance around how to apply the laws that already exist in this context. Four, we want to be principles-based and not prescriptive, because the moment you put a marker down and say you can't do this, someone will have found a way around that marker. And fourth, fifth, we were not going to focus specifically on third parties. We were going to make our licensees responsible for their use of third-party systems. So to that end, we broke into working groups, very highly collaborative, very broad. 20-some states were involved in the drafting of the bulletin that allowed us to work through, build consensus, work through issues. We had an internal exposure of that in June. We agreed as a body that this was appropriate to expose to the public. We exposed that in July. We got lots of good comments. We had a public hearing on it during our meeting in Seattle. We took those comments, we turned them around, we made some adjustments, we added some additional consumer protections, we made sure that our focus was more on outcomes-based. And so with those adjustments, we then did another exposure draft on October 13th. We've had a smaller number of comments, and we will have a public hearing tomorrow to invite folks who still have some concerns or questions about this. Actually today, I'm sorry, it's actually today, to talk about that. We will have a regulator-only meeting tomorrow to sort of then absorb what we've heard and decide, are we at the point now where we're ready to vote on whether this is in fact the model, or do we have to make some more tweaks? So that is the status of where we are. I know some people have asked the question of why a bulletin. I hope I've answered that question, because we think you all have done a pretty good job of laying out the foundational laws that we can apply in this circumstance and in any circumstance. I would also highlight that this is our next step. It doesn't mean that it's our last step. There are other issues that we also have to address. We also have to be concerned about and think about what are the individual use cases. We have to think about third-party frameworks. We have to think about what are the enforcement mechanisms. We have to build out our market conduct handbook, for example, in order to provide more concrete questioning as when examiners come in to talk about predictive models and are conducting a market conduct exam. We have to have tools and education. So you're going to see some discussion about that. Those of you who follow us, you'll see some discussion about that in Orlando in December. So there will be more to come in that way, and I will conclude with that and wait for any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. I appreciate your input. Last, we have Adam. It's either Isles or Islis, and I didn't ask him beforehand. I asked ChatGPT, and it didn't know either, so I'm now informed that it is Isles.
So I was in New York yesterday at something called the Aspen Cybersecurity Forum, and I'm at the Chertoff Group. I'm responsible for cybersecurity practice there. And these forums are usually collegial. It was actually a highly emotional forum yesterday, and the reason it is because in part the Securities and Exchange Commission 2 weeks ago filed an enforcement action against a company called SolarWinds. And SolarWinds is the provider of network management software for a number of countries around the world. And it was compromised in 2020 by the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service. And the SEC's complaint basically said, it alleged that SolarWinds has made misstatements about the state of its security, and they also not only charged the company, but charged the chief information security officer, essentially with securities fraud, and are seeking a lifetime ban on his further employment. And so, part of the question is, in that case, I'm not expressing a view on the merits of the SEC's enforcement action or not, is like, what's the goalpost? And the reality is that in the software space, from a security perspective, we haven't really had a goalpost until relatively recently. There have been snippets of goalposts. There are, OWASP top 10 vulnerability reduction standards, et cetera. But it's only more recently that NIST has been developing a comprehensive, here's what lifecycle software security actually looks like. The other piece to this is, part of the SolarWinds attack involved not only the compromise of SolarWinds software itself, but also the leveraging of cloud technology, basically as a stepping stone into victim organizations. And what the Russians did essentially was not leverage a vulnerability, but leverage a feature of what's in some of the largest cloud providers. And I raise that because what we were dealing with there wasn't a kind of a software coding error. It was like, how is this actually being used by human beings? And as we think about security here, I think there's a question not only, and Christine, I think maybe some of this was reflected in your remarks, the commissioners as well, is it's not just that we have technology that exists, but we have technology that has to be used by real human beings at some point. I mean, even though the definition of artificial intelligence is getting computers to think like humans, at the end of the day, there's a human that's sitting behind a computer. And so part of as we think towards the future on what is effective use of artificial intelligence looks like is about the humans using it as much as the technology itself. So we've had, we're a security advisory firm, and we have clients across a number of sectors, and particularly with consumerization of artificial intelligence, we had lots of our clients coming to us and say, how do we bound artificial intelligence related risk? You can't go a day without reading something in the headlines about deep fakes or AI subversion or unintended consequences. And so we've created a white paper that's available to you. It's on the NQL website that tries to take a stab at saying, all right, if your boss were to come to you and say, what are the AI risks we're facing? How do we start answering that question? And what we found when we looked at this is really the risks fall into three broad buckets. The first bucket is, and I should say I started my career 26 years ago at the U.S. Justice Department in the Criminal Division, and in 1997, that was the time when we were dealing with kind of the consumerization of network computing, right? People started to have email addresses. They started to have, Netscape was just available, web browsing technology. And so how do we explain what computer crime was? And the analogy here is, as we think about artificial intelligence, there are risks around artificial intelligence based on the weaponization of AI by bad guys, right? So there are risks around AI of the targeting of AI systems themselves. And then a lot of what we've been talking about here is a third category, which is really around unintended consequences. We have intended legitimate use of AI that for whatever reason is generating unintended consequences either on the inputs or the outputs. So let's kind of unpack each of those three categories. As we start to think about the weaponization of AI, this is really about someone else misusing AI to impact you. And a lot of the discussion relates to, the technical jargon term is synthetic content, which is basically deep fakes, right? It's someone creating a fake text, audio, video piece of content to trick someone. And this is real now. This is not make-believe. I mean, we're seeing audio deepfakes today being used to support social engineering to gain initial access into companies. In the white paper, we talk about a company called Retool. It's a software provider that will tell you how audio deepfakes were used to trick a help desk into granting access. We're seeing it in benefits fraud. The Inspector General of the Social Security Administration talked about how audio deepfakes were being used to essentially stand in the shoes of a legitimate benefit applicant. So we're certainly seeing concerns around deepfakes as well in a disinformation context. I mean, for those of you that are focused on geopolitical risk, there's a kind of an infamous video of Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of the Ukraine, surrendering to Russia in March of 2022, which of course he didn't do, but that's what the video said he did. So we have concerns around the use of deepfakes, as well as AI being used to generate polymorphic malware, find vulnerabilities in code, and conduct other forms of research. I think the answer for this first category of risk is probably more in the traditional. What are we doing from a cybersecurity perspective, a fraud perspective, to be able to make sure that our systems, are continue to be able to defend against more sophisticated bad guy tradecraft. The second category of risk is around the targeting of AI systems themselves. And so, when Jamin talked about, the ingredients to, what AI technology, we're talking about data, we're talking about prompts, the algorithms that support them. And we have for some period of time seen, and we're seeing increasingly the targeting of those inputs as well. So Microsoft years ago had a Twitter bot called Tay. It was designed to kind of monitor Twitter activity and generate responses. People found out about it and decided to play with it. Microsoft, I think within a day, took Tay down because it basically became a racist jerk. We've seen security researchers take, in the autonomous vehicle context, tradecraft around, playing around with stickers on stop signs to trick self-driving cars into ignoring the stop signs. So we see, data manipulation in the context of the integrity of these systems. We worry about confidentiality leaks. The data that supports large-scale, foundational models being exfiltrated, and then availability of these systems. If you think about some of the recent reporting, we've seen OpenAI, one of the largest providers of these systems, has been experiencing what are known as distributed denial of service attacks, DDoS attacks, that are impacting the availability of these systems. So the answer here, right, is again, we're seeing, elements of traditional cybersecurity defense. But we're also starting to think about, okay, well, how are we thinking about the safety and the security of these systems as well? And this bleeds into the third category of risk, which is really around unintended consequences. And fundamentally, there are two pieces of unintended consequence. There are unintended consequences around inputs to AI and around outputs. And on the input side, what we've seen are people kind of experimenting with ChatGPT and other technologies by dumping proprietary source code into these products. And so you've got a kind of a confidentiality issue involved in doing that. And I say this with mixed emotions because what I don't want my remarks to come across as, we don't want our employees to be using this technology. I think that's the wrong answer. Again, when I started my career at DOJ, the Attorney General actually specifically directed that all DOJ employees be allowed to use network technologies, access the web, and even to do so for personal use, because there was an imperative around educating employees around this technology and having people start to become conversant with it. Do there need to be guardrails? Absolutely. But we can talk more about what those are. Outputs are, what Jamin and Christine, talked about as well. I mean, we've seen bias, we've seen unintended consequences. We've seen how does a generative AI system, how does a deep learning system actually execute on tasks? I actually grew up in New York City, and so I think about autonomous vehicles and it's kind of self-driving technology. And I think about a car driving down West End Avenue where you've got a UPS truck sitting in front of you, double parked, and the only way you can drive is to basically cross the double yellow line. So, how are you training, autonomous vehicle technology to deal with that? Obviously, work to be done there. I think that the answer in this space is to think about how do we start to frameworks in place for the providers of these technologies to have some basis for what reasonable good faith approaches look like. And in this respect, NIST earlier this year came out with a framework for managing artificial intelligence risk. And there are core attributes that NIST describes around essentially trustworthy AI. And so what do those look like? We think about, and as Christine was talking, I was thinking through, okay, how many of these do or do not, the insurance system that you were talking about actually meet? Is it reliable? Is it safe? How do we think about human safety? Is it secure? Is there a level of transparency and explainability into how these systems work? Are they fair? And are they privacy enhancing? And I think as we start to think about, okay, we're thinking about using some of this technology, does it approach meeting any of the criteria for trustworthiness that NIST has laid out? Interesting question to ask. When Michael Chertoff, the person who founded our firm, former federal judge, Secretary of Homeland Security, talks about AI, he talks about the 3 Ds. And the 3 Ds are data, disclosure, and decisions. So the data piece is, do we have transparency around what the input data is essentially to these systems? Do we have a legal right to use it? I mean, if you follow some of the discourse around this, we get into real questions around provenance and is that data yours? Did you screen scrape it from somewhere? Is there a fair use doctrine that allows you to use it? The second D is around disclosure, which is if you're using synthetic content, if you're using AI technologies, are you disclosing that to the people whose lives are impacted? And the third piece is around decision making, right? Which is essentially for important decisions, is there a human in the loop? And I think in some ways this is the hardest one because you're in this tension between the kind of the volume of information people are dealing with on the one hand versus the accuracy and fairness of the decisions that are being made. I spent part of my career at the Department of Homeland Security, and DHS processes 1 million people legally coming across the border every day. And so the only way you can manage risk around that is to use, and for years, supervised learning has been enabled to essentially risk assess travelers coming into the country. There's always a human in the loop, once those initial risk determinations have been made. But I think that's a hard question to look at. I think that one of the trends that we see in industry right now are industry organizations starting to develop their own AI principles. So last week, the National Retail Federation released a set of principles for responsible use of AI. And I think part of what we want to encourage is industry to be looking at, how do we self-regulate on these topics as well. Fundamentally, I think we're bringing together threads from different domains to responsibly use AI. I've talked a lot about cybersecurity. In the online trust and safety space, there are, I think, precedents around content moderation that are relevant as well. But I'll stop there and open it up to questions.
Thank you so much, Adam. Really appreciated everybody's comments. And I want to open this up to questions before I open it to others, because I have the gavel. I get to ask the first question. And then we'll go to you. My first question actually kind of speaks to your point about autonomous vehicles. When that technology first came out, we as a society determined that was just going to have an earth-shattering effect on the market and on our lives. And here we are several years later, and it hasn't really advanced the way that we anticipated it would, a lot for reasons like you just mentioned. So in you all's opinion, there is obviously a lot of justified hype around AI and what it's doing in various industries, but do you think that we will see the same kind of hiccups occur that will kind of slow that innovation, not necessarily good or bad, but or do you think that the hype is really justified?
Thank you, Representative. I think it's a great question. How much of this is hype And we've seen that kind of hype with, as you say, AV. We've also seen it with blockchain technology and others. I think the key distinction with AI, and in particular as we see continued advancements with generative AI though, is that the technology is already in the hands of the everyday retail consumer. And that's not what we previously saw with the likes of autonomous vehicles or blockchain technology that requires massive societal coordination. And so that's why, various companies ask what should be our policy or what are best practices for governing the use of generative AI systems among our colleagues. And I often say, well, not having an explicit policy is having a policy, because nothing prevents colleagues and everyday individuals from going home after the workplace and opening up ChatGPT on their personal laptops and feeding in company information. In fact, I would argue that the best defensive posture is to have a proactive posture specific to organizations, allowing colleagues to use specific forms of AI, generative AI systems and not others, and being clear about the limitations as well as the opportunities. So I don't think this one is particularly a hype because it's already here in our hands.
I think one other thing that I would mention is that I think sometimes we get very focused on this concept of what is the ultimate aim. So we think of autonomous vehicles and that technology only literally with regard to a non-driver, right? But autonomous vehicle features exist on most of the cars that we drive today. And they utilize AI on a constant basis to guide that car use experience. And just to give you an example of how that touches insurance in particular, is that when an accident occurs between two vehicles, or perhaps a standalone accident, the question is always about who's at fault, like who did what, when, where, and how, and who is responsible to what degree. And is this a chargeable accident, that is going to affect your rate or not? And what we're finding is that AI that's in that vehicle, the photography, but more importantly, how the car is reacting at each point, is something that is going deeper and deeper into the claims system. So that when the Tesla misreads the object ahead and then causes the car to swerve back into its lane, and then there's an accident that occurs, or when the technology again gets it wrong and misreads something and causes a car to go off the road, what does that mean? So, what I would say is that perhaps we don't have the promise or the vision or whatever of fully automated vehicles, but incrementally along the way, there are technologies and there are uses that are happening that do have profound applications and uses in the real world in the business of insurance. And as regulators, that's what we have to be on top of in making sure that we understand how that's being used on a day-to-day basis, where and how.
Anyone else wants to respond? Representative Lehman, you may ask your question.
Yes, thank you. So one is maybe just a general comment and get your thoughts on this, and then the second is a specific question for you, Madam Commissioner, and that is, we had in Indiana multiple hearings over AI, and the one thing that kept coming back to, and I think Ms. Kim, you mentioned the word conversational, is that we've had technology, but now it's talking to us, right? We're in this conversation. And the word they kept using was, it now has intuition. The technology has intuition. If you look at the definition of intuition, it's the ability to decide something immediately with no conscious reasoning, okay, which concerns me. Because if you take conscious reasoning, it's taking all of the facts and information available to you at any given time and making the correct decision. If we eliminate the gathering of data to make a logical decision, because we can do it immediately with all we already have in our system, it brings me to my insurance question. Departments of insurance are regulating from the standpoint of rates and fairness to the marketplace. I just came from some meetings with insurance other agents, and I'm going to pick on Minnesota for a second, my friend Paul Ecke there. Minnesota has become kind of the wind, hail mecca, and everybody, I'm hearing all the horror stories about coming out of that. So a rate aside, if I go to my book of business, and I have 5,000 homes right now insured in the state of Minnesota, and if I go to that book of business and I say, hey, AI, give me the next 100 claims I'm going to have based on age of the home, age of the roof, age of the owner, location, and suddenly, and within seconds, I'm going to have the data of here are the next 100 people that will cost you money. Can I non-renew them based on that? Can I begin to use this technology to say, okay, as much as emerging markets are saying, we're spreading the risk on flood, we're figuring out how to write flood, will the market also figure out who not to write? And now we're not talking about rate, we're talking about access to market. And so, as I said, I'm hearing the horror stories in Minnesota about even like wind hail deductibles now are 2%, 3%. I've got $40 million of property. That's a massive deductible. But again, it's what is dictated by the market. So I'm just curious about where the market goes with the ability to not write risk, let alone rate risk.
So I would say the example you gave, it would be a flat no. They would not be able to non-renew on that basis. Every insurance company is required to have underwriting standards that apply everywhere. And they have rating rules and rating standards, right? So I'm thinking about a circumstance in which a company could if you have a rate, you can't not apply that rate to someone who meets your rules because you think they're more likely to be a claimant. Your predictive analytics around who is riskier than whom and who you want to write or not write is supposed to be baked into your objective underwriting standards and into your rating rules. So if Mary has a house that meets your underwriting standards and you have a rate for that house, you have to write it and you have to renew it, even though you might have decided because of whatever you're looking at in that environment, she is more likely to be a claimant than somebody else that's in her exact little cell would be. So that would be my answer to you.
And maybe a follow-up to that is just in kind of that whole thing of, again, you're driven by that idea of conscious reasoning, right? Taking data and processing data. To the panel as a whole, is there any concern with technology going away from, computers don't have emotion, right? So they're going to take the data that's in their system and say, here's your answer, and it's going to be the, quote, right answer, regardless if we like it or not. But yet, we talked to multiple people I've heard say, humans have to be involved in this. And I asked, in our hearing, I asked the panelists, I said, how do you defeat bad AI? They said, well, with good AI. So you're literally going to have AI fighting AI. And again, where does the human touch come into that?
Well, I would just make one comment, and I'm sure there are others that will comment on this as well. I'm glad you brought up NIST, because if you read the NEIC's bulletin, you will see echoes of the NIST framework in there, because like Singapore, that's very much the approach that we took, is that recognizing that AI decision-making, while there are similar risks, the nature of the risks can be different because of the nature of the technology. And therefore, you have to have very firm governance and risk management mechanisms in place in order to control for those risks. So that's the approach that we have taken, and where we have driven the conversation is the expectation around what data you will use, what is the data hygiene, what are the standards for that data, so all of those steps that were laid out across the life of the bulletin, there are a set of regulatory expectations about how companies will address each of those steps. I appreciate the idea of being concerned about intuitive, quote-unquote, activities by a machine. But I will say to you that the other thing that the ultimate expectation is that the outcome for consumer impacting decisions by an insurance company are going to meet standards, and that we as regulators are going to be able to come in and understand the pattern of those standards to see whether or not they meet the laws that are in place. But I think you guys probably have.
Just say that there are issues both of accuracy and fairness. One of the NIST principles is around fairness, and I'll give you an example of, in a non kind of homeowners or health insurance context, what that can look like. So let's take facial recognition technology. So facial recognition technology on a one-to-one basis. Like, is, the Adam that's standing in front of you the same person, that's on the driver's license that you're looking at? Is highly accurate and precise now. When we start using it in a room like this to say, I'm scanning the room, is that Adam there? For someone that looks like me, who's a middle-aged white male, it can be highly accurate because there's a lot of training data. For other people, not so much necessarily. And so as we move from accuracy into fairness, we've seen the application of that technology in a wide variety of circumstances. I mean, if you go to Madison Square Garden and you're a lawyer, that has a plaintiff's action against the owners of that stadium, you're not going to get into the arena. Is that an appropriate use of the technology? So is it accurate, and then what are the circumstances around how we want to use it?
Just to add a brief comment, and I echo Adam's thoughts, and I think it's important to consider that as believable as these AI systems are becoming, and as human-like they seem to be becoming, they're still machines. And my question would be, well, do we trust any human 100% to make all of the right decisions as an individual actor? And the answer is no. That's why we have institutional structures, double checking, triple checking, and the saying the buck stops with the manager, and then with the manager's manager. And so even if we have significantly advanced generative AI systems that become increasingly so with time, I don't believe we can ever replace the human oversight aspect of simply just relying on these systems to tell us what to do and then executing.
To speak to the human oversight piece of the technology in question, there are humans involved, and as you mentioned, 2 medical directors that would be reviewing them. The issue is that they've become so constrictive and so that predictive date, that discharge date has become the end-all be-all, and all of the humans have to agree with it, essentially. And so all of the performance standards by the employees are based on how close to that number they are and how close they are getting to that predicted date. So I would say, yes, we are dealing with machines, but then the oversight needs to be with the humans that are operating them as well. Absolutely.
And maybe we can refine that to say skeptical humans, right?
Yes.
Because we cannot be programmed to
Yes.
just believe the machine. Okay, my brother-in-law and my sister and I and a friend of mine were in Virginia touring wineries. And my brother-in-law was taking us driving to the next winery, and he had this lovely British accent on his GPT system that was telling us where to go. And my sister and I are saying, oh, there it is, it's right there. There's the entrance, it's right there. Paul, you're driving by the entrance. Why are you driving by the entrance? Why don't we go into the entrance? Because he's listening to the machine that's telling him that the entrance is somewhere else, even though his own literal eyeballs can see the entrance. We stopped, fortunately, at the fence before he drove us into a field, right, where the actual vines were growing. But to me, that was so illustrative of the fact that he was focused on the accuracy of the machine. And machines can be very accurate, but sometimes machines are inaccurate. And those are the things that we need to be skeptical about and where we need to regulate.
Let's make one more point about how we've seen insurance applied in the cybersecurity space. A lot of this conversation has been around how are insurance companies using artificial intelligence. There's a separate use case around how are the users of artificial intelligence insuring themselves against harms that come out of the misuse of artificial intelligence. And it's going to take a while, but I think eventually, in the same way that in a homeowner's policy, you got to have a smoke detector in order to get homeowners insurance. Thinking about insurance as a tool not just for risk transfer but risk mitigation, I think it's going to take a while, but I think you're driving okay, we're looking to insure you against AI-related perils. Have you adopted the NIST framework for AI risk management, or an equivalent industry standard?
Thank you all so much for your feedback there. I think we had Senator Tice followed by Senator Ferguson, and we have about 8 minutes left of questions.
Thank you very much. I've got one kind of comment and concern. One comment and concern that has to do with biased access. The access itself isn't biased, but the response is. So I was, but it's like echoing everywhere. When looking for research, I specifically
So I think that's a great question. The bias that the AI system is reflecting actually reflects some of the human-directed bias that goes into creating the various guardrails put into these AI systems. Often what happens is that the companies that are developing these AI systems will have some kind of human group that is thinking about and assessing what kinds of guardrails need to be in place. But of course, as we've discussed, these systems are not 100% explainable, and they're nonlinear in just by their nature. And so what happens is, even if the guardrails that humans intentionally designed for these systems were well-intentioned, they may lead to inadvertently negative outcomes, at which point there needs to be a monitoring feedback loop with, again, human oversight to ensure that that feedback goes back into whoever are the humans in that group designing some of these guardrails. The only other comment I would make in association with this is that there are some hobbyist groups out there whose primary hobby is to try to jailbreak these systems and go against some of the guardrails that are put into these systems. And so even if there are sufficient and appropriate, what seem like sufficient and appropriate guardrails put in place in the first place, we do need continuous ongoing monitoring and maintenance of these systems, and especially monitoring how people are using and how people might be even jailbreaking some of the original guardrails put in place. All that to say, this, I think, aligns with the theme that we've heard from everyone on the panel, which is that we need consistent human oversight.
Where this is headed, whether you like it or not, is I think if you think about largest social media companies, the Metas of the world, the X's of the world, they have content moderation programs, right, to identify and remove what they consider to be harmful content. And you're going to see the same basic approach applied here, and it's probably as difficult as it is in a social media context. I expect it's going to be more difficult, even in this context.
So that's a good question, and it's an evolution of the battle of fault, right? So in today's environment, what you would have is the insurance company would respond to the loss because there was, in fact, a loss. The issue is almost more, I'm going to use the word subrogation, that's not completely accurate, but the issue is what happens when then there's the class action lawsuit against the vehicle manufacturer, because there are flaws in the vehicle. So, and the sort of the ultimate tension between, where that ultimate fault lies and who ultimately is the payor we just had the discussion at the Northeast Zone meeting about how that is going to play out.
Thank you all for that. Our last question will be from Fearless Leader, President Ferguson.
Thank you. Yeah, and I agree with everything you said. In medicine, we like to call it augmented intelligence. You know, you read an x-ray, the computer reads it, but then you have a radiologist over-reading it to make sure it's accurate. But that's not my question. Do we risk over-regulating and stifling innovation? That's what I hear from tech people.
I think the shortest answer to that would be potentially yes, but that potential has always been there for any kind of new legislation or regulation when it comes in response to emerging technologies. I think what Commissioner Kathleen said around ensuring that we have a principles-based approach as opposed to a rules-based approach resonates with me personally, in the sense that even if there were to be a list of specific rules that developers of AI systems and users must follow, that will probably need to be thrown out in at least a couple days' time even, because the technology keeps evolving at lightning speed. And so I think it's important to take a step back and consider, we don't want to be so fearful and call this a doomsday scenario, but we also don't want to think that this is, actually the best thing since sliced bread. So from a principle standpoint, what do we stand for? Why are we developing these AI systems? To what end? For what kinds of use cases? And given those use cases, how do we protect the interests of both consumers as well as industries?
So, Madam President, I would say that your concerns are exactly the concerns of the NAIC and the group that has been working towards the model bulletin. The NAIC published its principles in 2020. This is the next step in looking at how do we take that very high-level principles-based approach and begin to create some regulatory guidance and regulatory expectations for the carriers that are now utilizing this and are looking to regulators to help them understand where the guardrails and where some of the lines are. But as you'll see from the bulletin, the approach that we take is very much about, it's proportionate. It follows the way we followed our cybersecurity, our information systems data model, which is to say, these are broad standards. We think you need to have a program in place. But what that program consists of, the depth of that program, what it covers, is going to be proportionate to how much you actually utilize AI, internal AI versus external AI, and then it lays out a frame of reference for considerations that companies will have to decide how that's going to work specifically for them, because a huge multinational global company is going to be very different than a single line, a monoline employer in a single state. And so what we've tried to create is a flexible framework that can be utilized by the industry as a whole. And then, of course, once the bulletin is published, it will be up to each state to decide for its own purposes in its state, in its market, whether it's going to adopt that wholesale or whether it needs to be adjusted in order to address its own market. So your notion of not being prescriptive, but really understanding and approaching things in a principled way with proportionality is exactly how we've approached it.
I would just quickly say that in the NIST framework, there's a feature of the framework that talks about mapping the AI use case, and so I think part of the answer here depends on the inherent risk of the AI use case we're talking about.
I would just like to add, too, that I'm here to tell you that this is technology that hasn't been regulated for 10 years, and it's caused a lot of harm, so there needs to be something. And even their technology could have even been enhanced by some regulation by having those guardrails sooner.
Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists for their contributions and to our legislators for their questions. We will wrap this up now. Next up for legislators is a lunch next door, and if you're not invited to that, you can just ponder the existential effects of AI for the next hour or so. Thank you all so much, and I will call this to a close.